Welcome back. In this context video for Twelfth Night, I've got a lot to tell you. I want to tell you a bit about Shakespeare's background, his life, and then I want to talk to you in detail about the culture of theater in 16th century and 17th century London. That's a really important element of what we want to understand this week. So let's start with Shakespeare. You may know that Shakespeare is born in Stratford upon Avon. Often that's a fact about Shakespeare that a lot of people know. This is about a 2-day trip from London on horse and a 4-day trip on foot, if for context, in terms of how far away is Stratford from London. So this is where he's born. It's where he meets his wife, and it's where he has 3 children with that wife. Susanna's firstborn, born 6 months after he was married. So sometimes people wonder if it was a kind of shotgun wedding. And then he has 2 twins, Judith and Hamnet. After that, we aren't quite sure where Shakespeare goes. The archival record becomes silent, and the next thing we know, he pops up in London. We start seeing people noting his presence in London doing different kinds of work. Once he moves to London, he starts working as an actor and a playwright. And so we know that he's in London around 1590, about 5 years after his twins are born. And he starts his work, as I said, as an actor and a playwright, and just continues on that track, on that career. And he becomes increasingly more prominent and more powerful in that career, starting from kind of a lowly actor to a playwright to ultimately a shareholder in a theater company, so that he's not just getting paid to write his plays, he's not just getting paid to act, but he's actually making money from the performances themselves. So he's risen in this career to a very lucrative position in which he is a shareholder in a successful theater company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which is later named the King's Men, and I'll explain a little bit more about those names in a little bit. And he does very well. Meanwhile, Anne lives back in Stratford and manages their home and estate back there. He lives the majority of his life here in London, and for 2 decades, from 1590, to around 1613, around 24 years, he's in London writing plays. And it's around 1613 or so that we think he begins to become ill, and he returns home to Stratford and ultimately dies at the age of 52 in 1616. So that kind of covers the arc of Shakespeare's relatively short life as a very successful worker, impresario in the theater community in particular. Okay, well, before we can really understand what that means about Shakespeare's life, we have to understand a little bit more about theater. Okay, I'm going to move my head out of the way so we can compare poetry and theater as we know them so far. So, as you know, in our conversations, we've talked about how poetry is very upper class in nature, aristocrats, the elite write poetry. It's very literary, it's very respected and esteemed. And, sometimes it's very private, circulated to one's coterie in manuscript form rather than printed for the masses. And if it's not supported by your own wealth because you're some wealthy person, it's supported by a patron who pays for you to write that poetry. So poetry, very high status. Theater is the exact opposite. Theater is considered very low class. In fact, theaters are in the same neighborhood as brothels, as sex workers, and as bear baiting gardens, which is essentially when you tie up a bear, I'm like trigger warning for real, you tie up a bear and then you let dogs attack it. This was the kind of entertainment that surrounded theaters in 16th and 17th century London. So it's seen as very bawdy, very seedy, even kind of dangerous to go to the theater. And actors themselves were seen as vagrants, people without careers, people without guaranteed incomes. Sometimes they were arrested for being vagrants. Actors were arrested. So theater is not at all associated with literature or the fine arts in this point. It's considered a cheap, low-class form of entertainment. It is, however, a lucrative business. It makes a lot of money. And so Shakespeare's involvement in the theater may not be something that associates him with, say, the upper classes, but it does make him a lot of money. All right, I'm going to pause here because I have a lot more to say about theater, and I want to start a new video to do that.